All right, so in short, people need more money because a $15 minimum wage in 2024 is about $13 minimum wage in 2018 when you account for inflation. So it's important for wages to grow when inflation affects the value of the dollar. And with things like rent and groceries going up in the state of California, it's important we account for these areas of growth by allowing a higher minimum wage so people can sustain themselves.
So let's say you have 100 people on a $13 minimum wage job in California, and then you suddenly raise that bar to like $15. So now maybe only 80 people will get that $15 job, but 20 people will get zero because the company doesn't want to hire $115 people like minimum wage jobs.
Welcome to the third podcast of Disagree to Agree, the channel where high schoolers get a chance to debate each other over controversial and current issues. In this podcast, we're going to be discussing whether the minimum wage should be $15 in California. As many of you might know, former California Governor Jerry Brown signed into law Bill SB 3, which will increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour by 2022 for employers with more than 26 employees. On the side of pro-$15 minimum wage will be Aishik Bhattacharyya, arguing that Americans and the economy alike need the money that would be brought with an increased minimum wage. On the flip side, with the stance of anti-$15 minimum wage will be Samuel Shen, arguing that the $15 minimum wage sounds idealistic but is deeply flawed. Finally, my name is Isha Singh, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I will be asking questions directed towards specific panelists, and each will be given time to answer the question. They will also be given time to respond to each other. Panelists are encouraged to keep their answers informative and concise. Just to clarify, we'd like to remind you that the arguments the panelists present in this podcast do not necessarily reflect their actual views on this topic. With that, I have my first question for both of you. Before we begin presenting arguments, let's define minimum wage. What is it? How is it enforced? And what is its history? Aishik, please answer first. Then Sam, if you have anything to add, please do so after Aishik's response.
All right, so a minimum wage is a mandated minimum income enforced by the government that employers must give their employees to ensure a decent standard of living to protect their health and the well-being of the employees. And it makes sure that workers aren't exploited for too much work. It was originally passed after the Great Depression when FDR passed the Labor Standards Act. In the status quo, the federal minimum wage is $7.50. The California minimum wage is set to be $15 in 2022. And presently it is, I believe, $12.
Yeah, so I think Aishik covered most of it. And I know I'm arguing against minimum wage, like a $15 minimum wage, but I do want to acknowledge its uses. Like in the 1930s, when capitalism had absolutely zero regulations, workers might need to work 4 or 5 jobs to sustain their families. And I think it's really important, but it's also important not to take minimum wage too far, or else it becomes a luxury we can't afford. And minimum wage is enforced through fines, so employees can report their employers to the government, and the government will fine their employers if they don't pay them enough.
Okay, great. Now that we have a definition and some context, let's start getting into the arguments. This first question is for you, Aishik. Why do we need to increase the minimum wage? What exactly is the problem with the status quo?
All right, so in short, people need more money because a $15 minimum wage in 2024 is about $13 minimum wage in 2018 when you account for inflation. So it's important for wages to grow when inflation affects the value of the dollar. And with things like rent and groceries going up in the state of California, it's important we account for these areas of growth by allowing a higher minimum wage so people can sustain themselves. And if you want to look at the statistics, the U.S. Department of Agriculture states that the average expected increase in the price of groceries is 2 to 3%.
Okay, great. And Sam, why would this not work?
Yeah, so Aishik talks a lot about how we have to keep increasing wages to account for inflation. And that's essentially job quality, like how much money you get from your job. But I think he's missing the main point and the most important point, which is like the quantity of jobs. When you do give people a higher minimum wage, companies will hire less workers and hire more selectively because they have to pay more for each worker. So let's say you have 100 people on a $13 minimum wage job in California, and then you suddenly raise that bar to like $15. So now maybe only 80 people will get that $15 job, but 20 people will get zero because the company doesn't want to hire $115 people like minimum wage jobs. So essentially, as a low income worker, personally, I'd rather get a guaranteed $13 job rather than get rejected potentially for a $15 job. And this is actually kind of confirmed by the statistics. So the Congressional Budget Office finds that a federal $15 minimum wage would destroy 3.7 million jobs in just 4 years. And California has 12% of the US population, so you can expect a lot of those jobs, like in a $15 California minimum wage, to be destroyed too.
Okay, I understand where you're coming at from job quantity, but I'd argue currently, or at least pre-COVID, job quantity was doing fantastic. California unemployment already hit 4%, which is a national average, and it's pretty agreeable that like the unemployment rate has been doing pretty well in recent years. So I'd say right now is the perfect time to make sure that we increase the quality of jobs because 3.3 million households in California are living paycheck to paycheck.
Okay, like obviously pre-COVID, our economy was doing pretty well. Like we haven't had a recession since like a big recession since 2008. But like unemployment was 4% before, but now it's actually projected to be 14.7%, and that's what the government figure. And a Forbes article actually writes that like actual unemployment is probably closer to 20% because the government's trying to disguise how bad unemployment is right now. And like 20% or above for unemployment is pretty much a depression. So with the economy in such a bust and unemployment so high, I would definitely argue that especially during COVID, quantity of jobs is way more important than wages and quality of jobs.
Okay, to clarify, I pretty much agree with you on everything you said during COVID. I think it's more important we focus on job quantity over quality during COVID to have the economy recover. But all my arguments that I'm going to say from here on forth are going to be in a society where we don't have to deal with the pandemic. So it's like maybe like pre-2020 or something like that.
Okay, so you're just thinking about like as a whole, how we're progressing the economy like in 50 years from now, like what direction?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, great. So during that conversation, I heard Sam talk about the job market. Aishik, would giving a higher minimum wage hurt the job market as companies would have to give better conditions and hire more selectively?
Yes, it will hurt jobs, but realize that you must take into account for inflation because the ones that benefit the most out of inflation are corporations. And I'm not making an argument saying like F corporations, corporations need to like do better for the employers, but I'm saying that when you're going to implement the minimum wage, it can really help the people at the bottom without taking too much from the people at the top. And then that's super important. Like as I've stated before, they're able to afford groceries. And also, we've seen this with stimulus checks where when people got extra money in their pockets, the 80% of them spent them on food. So clearly, we know that people really need the money. And also, again, we had good unemployment pre-corona, so I'd say this is a pretty good trade-off.
Okay, so I think what Ishik misses is that corporations are like completely profit based. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like in a capitalistic society, being selfish is one of the best things you can do because when you're selfish, you actually benefit those around you. But like when a corporation is offered two choices, like make a big profit or make a super big profit, they're going to choose make a super big profit. So while corporations do benefit from inflation, that doesn't mean they're automatically going to, out of goodwill, be willing to hire more employees, give them even higher wages, give higher conditions, see returns. Companies are going to try to pay workers less if possible, hire less workers if they can get the same work done, like no matter how much profit they're making. So companies, like worst case scenario, they might even look into automation, which is way cheaper than human labor. They might move to other states where regulations are less severe. Or like the most probable is they just increase credentials required to have a job.
Okay, so then Sam, next question. As inflation increases and the value of the dollar decreases, why is it not fair to give Americans more money when that money is losing its value?
Okay, so I obviously agree inflation does increase over time. Like products become more expensive. People need more money to buy those products. But like in the really expensive areas in California, like basically where we live in Sunnyvale, San Jose, Mountain View, et cetera, the Bay Area, basically, like the local governments have already instated minimum wages that are higher than $15. So the minimum wage isn't actually like consistent throughout California. There's like a California minimum wage, and then by area, they have like their own little minimum wage. So I would say like giving the $15 minimum wage to a state as a whole would really hurt rural areas that don't need it, and the really urban expensive areas that need it already haven't stated it themselves. And I guess the second thing about inflation is when you're giving everybody more money, that doesn't mean everybody can afford more things, because giving everybody more spending power is practically the same as giving nobody spending power, because when everybody can afford more, companies spike prices. For example, McDonald's McChicken was just like $1, I think a few years ago, like when I bought it. But now a McDonald's McChicken is like $1.30. So why are they able to do that? Because there's more buying power. So this actually fuels into inflation, a higher minimum wage.
Okay, so the thing with big companies like McDonald's and many large department stores is that they have a big enough profit margin to elevate their labor cost and also keep the cost of their goods the same. So in the end, it wouldn't actually raise prices for the majority of consumers who get their goods from large stores, and it would keep the extra money in the people's pockets. And I agree, in theory, it may seem like it'll hurt rural businesses, but realize that the predominant employers in rural areas are companies like McDonald's that have a huge profit margin.
So, like, I obviously understand big companies like McDonald's, they have like a huge profit margin, but what incentive do they have to make a super big profit margin into just a big profit margin, um, and raising their prices? Like, is it out of goodwill?
No, it's going to be competition with other food chains. Like McDonald's is going to be competing with Burger King, Carl's Jr. to keep their prices low. So why would they want to raise their prices?
Okay, but the problem is when everybody, like all the consumers, are getting more money from a higher wage, all the food chains have the ability to increase their prices. So market prices as a whole do increase. So for example, like it's not just McDonald's that has made their burgers more expensive and now nobody's buying McDonald's. Like Burger King, In-N-Out, Wendy's, like whatever fast food places, they're all increasing their prices gradually.
Okay, well, okay, this is a different response, but the reason all food chains won't increase their prices is because not every single employer working for the fast food joint is going to get an increase in their wage. It's only going to be the people that are at the bottom with the minimum wage. So just increasing the wages of the people at the bottom aren't going to create a drastically new increase in the price of their burgers. It's not like a UBI where we're giving every single citizen a check. It's just people at the bottom.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Okay, so those were some very good points, but I think now we're going to move on to a different aspect of this conversation. This question is for you again, Aishik. Does increasing the minimum wage reduce income inequality since you are giving people, generally people in the lower brackets, more money? And to add on, would this alleviate reliance on government handouts such as welfare and healthcare and also improve financial security with better retirement plans?
Okay, I think it would definitely decrease income inequality because you're giving the people in need more money. So you're essentially raising the floor. And from the people you're taking away money from, you're lowering their ceiling. Also, when you're lowering the ceiling of the big corporations, you're not lowering it that much since they already have a huge profit margin. You're just giving up a little from their end to help the people at the bottom. I'd say this is a pretty ideal trade-off between the rich and the poor to decrease income inequality. And to your point on welfare and healthcare, I think things like retirement plans would definitely improve with more savings and self-sufficiency. So they decrease reliance on government programs for sure. And obviously, decreasing reliance on the government is a good thing that we can agree on.
Okay, so I think Ishik slightly conflates how much increasing like somebody's wage slightly can actually overall affect their financial responsibility. So like financial responsibility is definitely a double-sided coin. It's not only how much you're earning, it's also how you're spending that money. So earning more money has to be accompanied by spending effectively, which means either saving or investing or just wasting less. So actually the spending patterns in the lower brackets are the worst. So for example, those who earn under $30,000 per year, they buy way more lottery tickets than those who earn like, let's say 60,000 or above, those who can actually afford those tickets. So those who earn below 30,000 play something like 30%, 30% of them play every week. So without enforcing responsible spending, which government programs actually do, which I know we're saying they're bad, but they actually do enforce you have to spend the money a certain way. Extra earnings can't make like that big of an impact on overall financial, like the financial life of a citizen when spending patterns remain pretty consistent. And about like the economic spectrum, Ishik talks about suppressing corporations and lifting up the lower class. But actually all this is going to do is bump some people out of the lower class because they get higher wages. But because less people in the lower class are getting jobs in the first place, because companies are hiring more selectively, you're actually trapping more people in the lower class beneath the poverty line. And that's pretty polarizing.
Okay, first off, I just want to address that's not like it's just not fair to say everyone in the low bracket are irresponsible spenders. Like I've said previously, when 3.3 million people, households in California are living paycheck to paycheck, it's in their best interest to probably spend that money on something worthwhile like groceries or rent. That's why when stimulus checks went out to the entire country, so I'm making a state to country comparison, 80% of people spent their money on groceries, 78% of people spent their money on rent. And it showed that the American people that really need it actually spend that surplus of money on things that are relevant. Americans are struggling to buy essentials. They're not going to waste the money. Also, sure, there might be people that might have irresponsible financial spending, but that's not fair. That's not a fair reason for us to generalize, and at least gives the people at the bottom a way to get out of like the situation they're drowning in.
Okay, so we've heard some very interesting perspectives from both panelists today. To conclude today's conversation, Aishik, can you please give a closing statement to reconcile everything that's been said today?
Yeah. So the first point I'd like to make is that when you have higher inflation, it only makes sense to increase the wages, because when prices go up, you need to increase the wages as well. It's completely unfair to have prices go up and then wages stay the same. Like I've said before, a $15 minimum wage in 2014 is equivalent to $13 per hour in 2018 after you adjust for inflation. This is a completely morally justified way to raise wage, because you can't expect people to pay for things that they did a couple years ago. The second thing I like to touch upon is that a minimum wage, in my opinion, is an ideal way to decrease income inequality. 3.3 million households in California living paycheck to paycheck is simply insane. When low-wage workers are going to see the biggest wage growth when the rich give up a little. And this will actually elevate them out of the lower class. It won't increase the lower class if you're giving people higher wages, and that's affecting 3.3 million people. And prices won't need to go up because we're only helping the bottom. We're not exactly doing a universal basic income system where everyone gets a surplus of money. So it's not going to drastically increase prices. And the last thing I like to talk about, which I think is very important, is that both of us have to reach some sort of common ground. And obviously, a minimum wage is not like a perfect solution in a utopian society, but we have to look for net benefit. Every policy brings good and every policy brings bad. But what I'm telling you is that a minimum wage on net is going to bring good. So one thing my opponents brought up is that they might have terrible financial responsibility, but once again, at least gives them an opportunity to get out of the pool they're drowning in. And we can't just assume that since the entire lower income class is bad, we just don't give everyone a increase in minimum wage. And we've seen this with stimulus checks, so we know that people spend it on actually good things. And the second thing is that my opponent argues that you have less jobs, but I'd argue right now the unemployment rate, pre-COVID, was already good enough that we can change our focus from the number of jobs to the quality of the jobs. And there's no better time to sort of work on that. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Aishik. And Sam, will you also give us a concluding statement connecting all of the main points of today's discussion?
Okay, so if I had to summarize what Aishik said today in probably one line, I would say higher minimum wage creates higher quality of life. And I obviously understand the concern. But first, I would say that areas that do have really high inflation and do have really high expenses, such as the Bay Area, already have $15 to $16 minimum wages. So we don't need that across the entirety of California where inflation isn't evenly distributed. And secondly, Aishik says that the quality of the job, like how much you're earning, is more important than quantity. But quantity, at least right now in the status quo, where unemployment is at 20% or above, and we're in a recession, I would say is probably more important, at least at the moment. Maybe in the future it's not, but at the moment it is. And to summarize what I'm trying to say, all businesses, corporations, and companies, they are basically profit driven at the end of the day. So that affects their hiring and their selling. So first is their hiring. Basically, they want labor for as cheap as possible. Doesn't matter if they have a humongous profit margin, they'll still cut costs on hiring. That's just how a company works. So when you do have to pay each employee more money, you're obviously going to hire less employees. So a lot of low skilled workers will lose their jobs. And that could be because of higher credentials required. That could be because of automation turning to machinery, or that could just be because of companies moving away and there's less jobs available because they want to go to places with less regulation. So end of the day, the Congressional Budget Office estimates 3.7 million jobs lost nationally in 4 years. And as I said earlier, California has 12% of the US population. So 12% of 3.7 million, not that good at math, but it's probably around 3 point something million jobs lost in California alone in just 4 years. And the second aspect that capitalism affects is how companies are selling their items. So when overall buying power increases because you're giving everybody an increased wage, companies are able to charge more. And we've seen companies raise their prices of their products over the past couple of years, and this actually contributes to inflation instead of solving for it. So I understand that higher minimum wage might seem like it completely correlates with the higher quality of life, but especially now during the pandemic, it's way too idealistic. It's a luxury we can't afford and has severe unintended repercussions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sim and Aishik, both of you, for your contributions today. I enjoyed moderating this conversation. To everybody watching, I hope you learned something interesting during this conversation today. If you feel strongly about whether or not we should implement a $15 minimum wage, please comment your thoughts down below or leave a comment about any future topics you'd like to see discussed. If you found this topic intriguing, please like and subscribe and share this video to increase conversations about the upcoming 2022 $15 minimum wage. That's all for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.